Put him on cleanup, Tanner Rutherford said, not to Elwood, but to Jules Tolliver, over Elwood's shoulder, as if the man standing 4 feet away, with mud already drying on his boots, were a piece of the fairground fencing. Nothing with a plug. Last thing we need is a liability out here. Why does the old man ask about fuel manifests before he's even touched a wrench? Jules would wonder that by the end of the week, but right now she only wondered why Tanner was talking about Elwood Satterfield, as though the man couldn't hear him, when Elwood was close enough to read the laminated run sheet clipped to Tanner's belt upside down. 3 days, the Cutlass Hollow Relief Camp had gone without full power. 406 people were sheltered across the fairgrounds' cattle barns and show halls, sleeping on cots between stalls that still smelled of livestock, and the number that mattered most to the camp's medical tent was written in grease pencil on a whiteboard nobody erased. 1 generator, condemned, sitting in the mud behind the maintenance fence like a shot horse nobody had gotten around to hauling off. Elwood didn't answer. He set his duffel down against the intake table, slow, the whole left side of him swinging around instead of reaching, the way a man moves when one shoulder has quietly stopped taking instructions from him. He was 78 years old, wearing a canvas barn coat gone the color of creek mud, buttoned wrong on the top button, over a set of coveralls with a trucking company's patch still stitched above the pocket, a company that hadn't run a truck in 20 years. He looked, to anyone glancing quickly, like exactly what Tanner had decided he was, an old volunteer who'd wandered in with the flood crowd and needed somewhere harmless to put his hands. If you've ever watched someone written off before they'd even opened their mouth, you already know how this camp's morning is about to go. Jules held the clipboard against her chest and didn't write down cleanup, not yet. She was 24, 6 months into a job that mostly meant checking names against a shelter roster and logging which generator fed which tent, and she had a habit, not yet earned, of watching people's hands before she watched their faces. Elwood's hands, resting on the intake table, were thick through the knuckle and split along 2 fingers in a way that looked less like accident and more like use, decades of it, the kind of use that didn't come from carrying folding chairs. "Sir," Tanner said, finally addressing him directly, the word arriving a half-second late, like an afterthought, bolted onto a sentence that had already been spoken to someone else. "We appreciate you coming out, really. But we've got a liability policy from the contractor's insurer, and anything with a plug or a fuel line, that's crew only. You understand?" "I understand policy," Elwood said. It was the first thing he'd said since walking through the gate, and it came out plain, without heat, the kind of sentence that closes a door instead of opening one. Then he picked his duffel back up, and in the 2 seconds it took him to sling it over the shoulder that would rise, Jules saw the corner of something rolled in canvas inside it, tied with a leather cord, and thought, without knowing why, that whatever that was, it had been carried a great many miles before it ever got to this one. The supper line formed at 5 that evening under 2 canopy tents strung with clip lights running off a generator that was, technically, someone else's assignment. Elwood stood in it like everyone else, plate in each hand, and Jules noticed that before she noticed anything else about him, he was carrying 2 plates, not 1, working his way down the serving trays with the particular unhurried patience of a man who has stood in a great many lines in his life and never once resented one of them. He filled both plates the same, cornbread first, then beans, then whatever meat the volunteers had stretched thin enough to feed 400 people, and he did it without looking at the second plate, the way another person checks a mirror without meaning to. Jules watched him carry both across the gravel toward the folding tables, and then watched him set the second plate down across from an empty seat, at a table where a woman sat alone, her hands shaking too badly around her own fork to manage much of the beans. He didn't say anything to her beyond a nod. He ate his own plate slowly, at her table, and when she was done and gone, he took her plate to the wash bin along with his, and nobody at that table had noticed either delivery happen. His coat had a canvas duffel leaned against the table leg the whole meal, unzipped an inch at the top, and inside it, coiled and cinched with a leather cord, was a roll of tools bundled like a drum major's baton, worn smooth at the places where a hand would grip it. Jules didn't ask. She'd learned already, in 6 months on this crew, that some bags you didn't open uninvited whether they belonged to grieving mothers or quiet old men, and the two categories weren't always as separate as people like to think. What she did see, on her way back to the equipment log after supper, was Elwood standing at the fence line behind the medical tent, in the dark, in front of a generator that fed the pediatric cots, a unit that had nothing to do with any assignment Tanner had given him, cleanup or otherwise. He wasn't touching it. He was looking at the fuel gauge on its side panel, reading it by the light of a keychain flashlight held in his teeth, and then he took a small notebook from his coat pocket, the kind sold 3 for $1 at any drugstore, and wrote something in it. A number, from what she could see over his shoulder. Just a number, and a time. She didn't ask him what it meant. She wrote her own note instead, in the margin of her intake clipboard, where nobody but her would read it. Old man checks gauges. Nobody assigned him. Doesn't say why. It was 2 mornings later, with the county liaison standing at Tanner's elbow in a windbreaker with a badge clipped to it, that Tanner decided the condemned generator would make a fine piece of theater. "This here," Tanner said, walking the liaison and half the crew out to the mud behind the maintenance fence, laminated run sheet in hand, "is Unit 4, Cutlass Hollow's problem child, fuel injector fault, carbon-fouled intake, cracked gasket on the valve cover, and a starter solenoid that's been dead since before I got here." He read it the way a man reads a grocery list to an audience he expects to be impressed by its length. "Our diagnostic laptop flagged 6 separate faults inside of 10 minutes. Company wrote it off as scrap 2 weeks ago. It's not worth the labor." The crew laughed. Not unkindly exactly, but easily. The way people laugh at a joke they've all silently agreed to find funny. Somebody said something about giving the old-timer a real challenge. Tanner looked pleased with himself in the particular way of a man performing competence for an audience rather than demonstrating it for a reason. "Since we've got extra hands today," Tanner said, and turned, and there was Elwood, arrived at the fence without anyone quite noticing him cross the yard, the way weather arrives sometimes, before you've looked at the sky. "Mr. Satterfield, you want something to do that isn't cleanup, here you go, knock yourself out." The liaison, a woman with a county badge and a clipboard of her own, looked between the two of them with the mild interest of someone filling an idle hour before her real business started. Elwood set his duffel down in the mud beside the generator, not answering the joke, and looked at the unit itself for a long moment before he looked at Tanner. "Your sheet say anything about the fuel line pressure? Before the pump, not after." Tanner glanced down at the laminated sheet, as if the answer might have appeared there since he last read it. "Laptop reads pump output, that's downstream. If it were a line problem, it'd throw a pressure fault code." "Would it?" Elwood said. Not a question. He crouched, slow, favoring the shoulder, and set 2 fingers against the fuel line where it ran from tank to pump, and didn't say anything else. "Look," Tanner said, already half turned back toward the liaison, done with the exchange. "The sheet's the sheet. Company diagnostics don't miss much. You want to poke at it, be my guest, but don't go promising these folks power off a scrap unit. We don't need that kind of disappointment in a camp like this." The insult, when Jules turned it over in her head later, wasn't in the words. It was in how quickly Tanner had already stopped listening, the way a man will close a door gently, thinking he's being kind about it. Elwood didn't answer that either. He reached into the duffel, drew out the canvas roll, and untied the cord. He worked alone, and he worked in the mud, and for the better part of the next hour, nobody paid him much attention because there was nothing loud to draw the eye. He'd laid a scrap of tarp beside the generator to kneel on, though kneeling cost him something visible in the set of his jaw, and beside it, he unrolled the canvas tool roll flat, each pocket holding 1 tool, numbered in faded marker on strips of tape, no tool touching another. He shut the fuel valve first, then he cracked the line at the pump fitting, slow, letting the pressure bleed instead of snapping it, and he held the open end to his nose for exactly as long as it takes to draw 1 breath, no longer, then set it down and sat with that a moment. He pulled the injector next, working the retaining bolts free, with a socket he chose, without hesitating over the row of choices in front of him, and he held the injector up to the gray morning light and turned it slowly between 2 fingers, studying the spray tip, the way another man might study a photograph for a face he half remembered. He worked the carburetor bowl loose after that, and tipped it, and what came out into his cupped palm was not fuel so much as a rust-colored sediment suspended in it, fine as pollen, and he rubbed a pinch of it between thumb and forefinger and said nothing to anyone, because there was no one close enough yet to say it to. From the doorway of the medical tent, 40 feet off, Jules watched him work through the sequence without asking a single question of him or offering a single unneeded hand. She'd expected, if she was honest, a kind of struggle, an old man defeated slowly by a machine too complicated for him. What she saw instead was a rhythm, unhurried and exact, each motion finishing completely before the next one started, the way water moves through a lock instead of over a dam. She started to believe him before she had any proof at all. Not because of what his hands were doing, she didn't understand enough of the machine to judge that, but because of what his face was doing while he did it, which was nothing, no frustration, no second-guessing. A man reading something he already knew how to read, in a language he'd simply been away from a long while. She would learn later that half of what convinced her that morning was true, and half of it wasn't. The truth was the hands. The half-truth was that she thought his stillness meant certainty, when in fact it was closer to grief, an old man handling a fuel line the way another man might handle a letter from someone long gone, careful because it was familiar, not because he already knew how the story ended. He worked the valve seat last, drawing the brass lapping tool from its slot in the canvas roll, the wooden handle of it worn pale and the shank stamped faintly with 2 initials Jules couldn't quite make out from that distance. He set a smear of fine grinding paste along the seat with one fingertip, fitted the tool, and began to turn it, back and forth, a quarter turn each way, lifting to check, turning again, in a patience that had nothing to do with hurry and everything to do with getting it exactly right the first time, because there would be no second time out here in the mud with 400 people counting on it. Somewhere behind her, Jules heard Tanner's voice pitched for the liaison's benefit, something about giving the old fellow his moment, and she didn't turn around to watch him say it, because she didn't want to miss whatever happened next. The camp's outage clock, chalked on the whiteboard by the intake tent, had read 71 hours and 40 minutes when Elwood knelt down in the mud. It read 72 hours flat when he wiped the last of the grinding paste from the valve seat with a clean rag, reassembled the carburetor bowl by feel, and reseated the injector with 3 even turns of the socket, no more, no less. He primed the fuel line by hand, working a small bulb pump until it firmed under his fingers, and then he stood, slow, using the generator's frame for leverage rather than his knee, and reached for the pull cord. It caught on the second pull. The engine turned over rough, for exactly 4 seconds, coughing, uncertain, the sound of something remembering how to be a machine again, and then it settled and smoothed and ran. The crowd that had gathered without anyone quite organizing it, crew, a dozen sheltered families drawn by the noise, the county liaison with her clipboard forgotten at her side, went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it has just watched something it was told, with confidence, could not happen. Not a gasp. Just a stillness, spreading outward from the fence line like a held breath finding its way around a room. 20 minutes. That was the whole of it, start to finish. From the moment Elwood untied the canvas roll to the moment the medical tent's lights steadied and the cold storage trailer's compressor kicked over with a hum that hadn't been heard in 3 days. Jules would say that number to herself so many times over the following week that it stopped sounding like a measurement and started sounding like a kind of proof. Tanner's laminated run sheet was still in his hand. He looked down at it. At the 6 faults his company's diagnostic laptop had flagged in 10 minutes, 2 weeks earlier. At the word scrap, written beside the unit number in a font that made everything look final, and then he looked up at the generator running clean in the mud, and he didn't say anything at all. The liaison did, though. "That's Unit 4, she said, mostly to herself, checking her own clipboard. "You had that logged as decommissioned." "It was," Tanner said. His voice had lost the pitch it carried for an audience. It came out smaller, aimed at no one. Elwood didn't look at either of them. He was crouched again at the fuel line, checking the fitting he'd bled earlier, tightening it a careful quarter turn, and then he took the small drugstore notebook from his coat pocket and wrote something in it. A number, a time. The same habit Jules had watched him keep at the pediatric generator 2 nights before, except this time 3 people were close enough to see him do it, and none of them understood yet why a man who'd just performed a resurrection with his bare hands would care more about a number in a notebook than about the applause starting hesitantly behind him. It was Jules who finally asked. She crossed the mud to where he knelt, ignoring the small crowd still finding its voice, and said, "What's the number for?" Elwood closed the notebook before he answered, the way a man closes a door he intends to open again later, on his own schedule. "Fuel level," he said. "Same reading I take every morning. This tank was fuller than the delivery sheet says it should be." "Fuller," Jules repeated. "Isn't that good?" "Depends," Elwood said, "on where the difference has been going the rest of the week." He stood, slow, the shoulder swinging him upright instead of lifting him, and looked past her at the fuel delivery truck parked by the depot fence, its manifest clipboard hanging from the mirror, same as it had all week. Man doesn't get to choose which numbers to believe, only whether he looks at all of them. That evening, the discrepancy had a name, though it took Jules most of the afternoon with a calculator, and Elwood's small notebook to give it one. Unit 4's tank, by Elwood's daily readings, had taken on less fuel over the past 6 days than the delivery manifests said had been poured into it, not by a wild margin, nothing that would jump off a page at a glance, but by a steady, repeatable percentage that held true whether she checked Tuesday's numbers or Thursday's. She laid the manifest sheets and Elwood's notebook side by side on the intake table and did the subtraction 3 times because she didn't trust the first 2. "It's not just this generator," she said, when she found Elwood again at the supper line, plate in each hand as always. "I pulled the manifests for units 2 and 7 while I was at it. Same gap, almost the exact same percentage." Elwood didn't look surprised, which frightened her more than if he had. 2 seasons, most likely, he said. Maybe longer. A man doesn't build a habit like that overnight, and he doesn't stop it easy either. Tanner found them there, having apparently spent the afternoon running the same subtraction Jules had, arriving at the same number by a different road, and looking considerably less steady for having gotten there on his own. He held his laminated run sheet loosely now, more habit than authority. "If this is a shortfall," he said, quiet, to both of them and to neither, "it's not just my camp, it's the whole regional contract. 3 sites, same supplier, same trucks." He didn't finish the thought out loud, but the arithmetic was plain enough on his face. A contract that size, a company that size, didn't lose a renewal over one broken generator. It lost one over a number like this, multiplied by every camp the fuel trucks touched. By the following morning, Tanner had made his decision, and it was the wrong one, though it would take him another full day to understand exactly how wrong. He arrived at Unit 4 with a fresh run sheet clipped to his belt, freshly printed, and a fresh justification already assembled in his mouth before Jules or Elwood had said a word to him. Company policy requires re-inspection of any field-repaired unit before continued deployment, he said, reading it the way he'd read the fault list 2 days earlier, except there was no crowd now to perform for, only Jules with her arms crossed, and Elwood standing with his weight settled back on his heels, unhurried. "I'm flagging 4 for pull and recondemnation pending review. Effective now." "It's running the cold storage," Jules said. "You pull it. That medicine's got maybe 6 hours before it turns." "There's a backup unit coming from the depot," Tanner said, though the flatness in his voice suggested he wasn't certain of that, the way he wanted to sound certain of it. Elwood said only one word to that, quiet, the kind of word that didn't ask to be argued with. "Why?" Tanner didn't answer him directly. "The county's moving up its equipment audit," he said instead to Jules, as though the reason might land better secondhand. Downstream camp reported the same fuel gap yesterday. Audit was scheduled for next week. It's coming in 2 days now, 6 a.m., day after tomorrow. He said it like a man reciting a sentence that had been handed down to him rather than one he'd chosen, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested he already understood what an auditor would find running clean and logged in an old man's handwriting, and what that finding would cost the company that signed his checks. "You pull that unit before the audit," Jules said. "There's no proof it ever ran wrong in the first place. No proof anybody condemned it early either." Tanner didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The silence did the answering for him, and it was the kind of silence that told Jules everything she needed to know about which direction his loyalty was currently pointed, even if it wasn't the direction he wanted it to point. The county's emergency management director arrived at Cutlass Hollow at 9 the next morning, a full day ahead of the audit team, in a truck, with municipal plates and a magnetic door seal that hadn't been reapplied quite straight. Grady Pickens was 61, broad through the chest in the way of a man who'd once done physical work and had since spent 30 years behind a desk that didn't erase it, and he walked the camp's gravel lanes with the particular economy of someone who has inspected a great many disaster sites and has stopped needing to look surprised by any of them. He had the shortfall reports in a folder under one arm, and Jules's name, and Elwood's on a printed volunteer roster in the other hand, and it was the second name that stopped him at the intake table, mid-stride, the way a man stops when a word in a sentence turns out to mean more than the sentence around it. "Satterfield," he said, to no one, reading it twice. "Elwood Satterfield." He looked up at Jules. "Where is he?" She pointed toward the supply shed, where Elwood was coiling a fuel line he'd salvaged for parts, and Grady Pickens walked toward it at a pace that had nothing professional left in it, the folder under his arm forgotten enough that its corner dragged against his trouser leg. He stopped in the shed doorway and looked at Elwood for a long moment before either of them said anything. Elwood looked up from the fuel line, unhurried, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite recognition yet, only the shape recognition takes before the name arrives to fill it. "Cutlass Hollow," Grady said finally. 39 years since I heard that name and yours in the same sentence." He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he reached into his jacket and drew out a small object wrapped in a shop rag and crossed the shed floor and set it on the workbench between them without a word of explanation, the way a man returns something he has carried so long it has become a kind of ballast. Elwood unwrapped it slow. It was a pressure gauge, brass-bodied, its glass face hairline cracked in one corner, but the needle still true, and stamped faintly into the housing beside the manufacturer's mark were two initials that matched the ones on the handle of the lapping tool still rolled in Elwood's duffel. "Ice storm took Hollow's main generator down to nothing," Grady said. Quiet now, all the county badge authority gone out of his voice, replaced by something younger. "I was 19. Private, first winter posting, didn't know a fuel line from a garden hose. You had that gauge frozen solid, cracked clean through the glass, and every other man on that crew said it was junk, pull a new one off supply. You said give it an hour." He looked at the gauge like it might still tell him something. "You warmed it against your own coat. Tapped the ice loose, a sliver at a time, so you wouldn't crack the mechanism worse. Had that generator running before sunup, and it kept 12 men warm through 4 more days of a storm that killed 2 soldiers at the next outpost over, doing exactly what we were doing, just without anybody like you standing over their machine." "You mailed it back to me," Elwood said. "It wasn't a question. Year after. Note said thank you. Nothing else. I've carried it in every truck I've driven since," Grady said. "Meant to return it in person more times than I can count. Never had the reason line up with the chance." He nodded once, toward the folder still tucked under his arm, toward the fuel manifests and the shortfall reports, and the audit moved up 2 days early on his own signature. Reason lined up this time. Neither of them said the word debt, and neither of them needed to. Elwood turned the gauge over once in his palm, feeling the crack in the glass with his thumb, the way another man might trace an old scar, and then he set it down on the workbench, gently, beside the fuel line he'd been coiling, and let it sit there between them, plain, the way a thing sits once it has finally arrived where it was always headed. The audit took most of 2 days once Grady's team got into the manifests properly, and what it found didn't surprise Elwood, though it surprised nearly everyone else at Cutlass Hollow. 2 full seasons of fuel deliveries across 3 relief camps had been underpoured against their manifests by a fixed percentage, small enough per truck to escape a glance, steady enough over months to add up to a paper surplus the regional office billed the county for at full retail. The signatures on the falsified totals belonged to site managers at all three camps, Tanner Rutherford's among them, but the numbers themselves, Grady's investigators found within a day, had been compiled and entered by the regional office before ever reaching the field for a countersignature. Tanner had been signing totals somebody else had already decided, filing a truth he'd never been shown a reason to doubt. He took that news standing at the intake table where he'd once told Jules to put Elwood on cleanup, and he didn't perform anything for anyone this time. "I signed those totals every week for 3 years," he said, mostly to himself. The laminated run sheet still clipped uselessly to his belt. Never once pulled a manifest against an actual gauge reading. Didn't think I needed to. Company said the numbers were clean. They were clean, the way a debt collector's arithmetic is clean, Elwood said. Correct, and still wrong. Grady offered Elwood, in front of the assembled crew, a formal county commendation and a line in the Emergency Management Department's newsletter, the kind of recognition that would have named him plainly as the man who'd caught a 2-season fraud with a drugstore notebook and a hand-filed valve tool. Elwood declined all of it, quiet, the same way he'd declined the faultless joke 2 days earlier, without heat. "Don't need my name in anybody's newsletter," he said. "Only thing I'll ask is that Jules's log stands as filed, and her job stands with it. She's the one did the arithmetic 3 times to be sure of it before she brought it to anybody." Grady looked at Jules like a man revising an estimate upward. "Already in the report," he said, "under her name, not his." That evening the supper line ran later than usual, the whole camp still talking low among itself about manifests and audits, and Elwood filled 2 plates the way he always did, cornbread first, then beans, then the meat stretched thin across 400 people who were, for the first time in 4 days, sleeping under lights that would hold till morning. He carried the second plate, as he always did, to a place across from someone eating alone and set it down without comment, and this time Jules, watching from 2 tables over, finally understood what she was seeing. It wasn't a habit, exactly. Or it was, but the kind that had a name behind it, a name nobody at the camp had heard him say aloud until Grady, sitting down heavily across from him with his own tray, asked, gentle, "Still setting a place for her at every table, aren't you?" "Margaret kept this camp supper line for near enough 30 years before the fairground ever flooded," Elwood said. "Every stranger that came through hungry, she found them a seat and a full plate before they'd finished saying their own name." He didn't look up from his own plate while he said it. "She's been gone 11 years. I still fill the second bowl. Give it away before anybody notices I did it." He said it plain, the way he said everything. No more weight on it than the fuel line question that had started all this, though the weight was there all the same, carried the way the gauge had been carried, 39 years in a coat pocket, waiting for a reason nobody could schedule. Elwood still fills 2 bowls at the supper line and gives the second one away before it's noticed, and that evening, for the first time since the flood put 400 people under canvas, nobody at Cutlass Hollow went without a full plate or a lit tent, and the man who'd made both possible sat at the far end of a folding table, saying grace over his own supper the way he must have said it over hers for 52 years, quiet enough that only Grady, sitting close, ever heard the words at all. 6 weeks later, the flood long receded and the fairground grounds mostly returned to grass. Cutlass Hollow's relief camp existed only as a handful of storage trailers and a supply shed nobody had gotten around to dismantling yet. The county kept it standing, at Grady Pickens's quiet insistence, officially as staging ground for the next emergency, unofficially as something closer to a keepsake. Elwood's canvas tool roll lived on a shelf in that shed now, by no arrangement anyone had made on paper, simply because he still came by twice a week to check the 2 remaining generators, the ones kept fueled and ready against the next flood season, and it was easier to leave the roll there than to carry it back and forth across town. The brass lapping tool sat in its numbered pocket, cord tied the same careful way each time, his initials worn nearly smooth on the shank from 60 years of the same grip, finding the same tool the same way. Tanner Rutherford still worked for the contractor, though the regional office that had compiled 2 seasons of falsified totals did not, its contract not renewed and its site managers reassigned, or, in 2 cases, let go outright, once the falsified totals were traced to signatures higher up the chain than Tanner's own. He'd kept his job at Cutlass Hollow specifically, a fact Grady had made sure of personally, and the change in him showed itself in small ways nobody would have written a newsletter about. He hand-delivered the week's fuel manifests to Jules's desk himself now, unprompted, laying them flat rather than clipping them to a board, and waited while she checked them against her own log before he'd sign off on a single truck. Numbers matched, Jules told him, most weeks, and most weeks he said something close to thank you, and meant it in a way he hadn't 3 months earlier, when the words would have been performance rather than plain fact. Elwood came by the shed on a Thursday evening in early autumn, the light going long and low over the grass where the cattle barns had stood, and worked the 2 standing generators through their weekly check, the way he always did, unhurried, each motion finishing before the next one started. He wiped the brass lapping tool clean afterward, though it hadn't needed using that evening, and rolled it back into its place in the canvas, and tied the cord the same 3 turns he always tied it. He carried 2 bowls to the supper table that night, same as he had every night the camp still ran a line worth carrying a plate to, cornbread first, then beans, and he set the second bowl down across from an empty seat, where, this particular evening, nobody at all was sitting, and ate his own supper slow, in the quiet, with the generator humming steady, behind him in the dark, like something that had finally remembered how to keep its own breath. Some machines just need someone who still remembers how they breathe.